The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Aloha everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting. My name is Kawai Domingo, and I will be starting the meeting off with an oli. It's called E Ho Mai. If you know it, please go ahead and join me. E ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e. O nā mea huna no e au. O nā mele. E ho mai. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, ka ike mai luna mai e. O nā mea huna no e au, o nā mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai, ka ike mai luna mai e. O nā mea huna no e au, o nā mele. E ho mai, e ho mai, e ho mai e. Mahalo. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our superintendent for Haleakala National Park, Natalie Gates.
Thank you, Kawai. That was lovely. Good evening, welcome, and aloha kako. My name is Natalie Gates, and I have served as superintendent of Haleakala National Park since 2013. Haleakala National Park is a unit of the National Park Service. The National Park Service, along with the State of Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, are collaborating on an important effort to save several species of native Hawaiian forest birds from extinction. The project we are presenting tonight is Suppression of Non-Native Mosquito Populations to address the impacts of avian malaria on threatened and endangered forest birds. Tonight, you will hear some very knowledgeable people tell you a number of stories. The first story is the sad story of native Hawaiian forest birds. How many of them are headed for extinction in the near future, why that is, and why the pace of extinction is accelerating. You will also hear a more hopeful story of what the National Park Service and the state of Hawaii are proposing to do to delay or prevent that extinction. And you will be given the opportunity to ask questions both tonight and on January 6th with the same presentation on both dates, and to provide formal comments. Because the one thing we know for sure is that the Park Service and DLNR cannot do this alone. We need the understanding and the support of the community, or these birds will not survive. Next slide, please. I'm going to take you through an agenda, and we'll start off with webinar logistics, and then the presentation, which I seem to have lost from my screen. Hold on. Sorry. We're going to talk about the laws that guide us in this process, the purpose and need and the background for the project, the proposed action, project area, the effects of the project and schedule, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end for question and answers. Next slide, please. So when you look at your control panel, you'll notice a few things. At any time during the webinar, you can enter a question into the chat box on your control panel. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. We're going to try to get to every question that we can. And you should know that all attendees will be in a listen-only mode, so you don't need to worry about muting your microphone. Next slide, please. It's important to know that the comments that are put into the chat box as part of this webinar will not be considered formal comments for the environmental assessment. If you'd like to provide formal comments, they must be received no later than January 20th, 2022, and they can be submitted two ways. Electronically at the website that we've indicated below, parkplanning@nps.gov/HALE-mosquito. That link will be repeated a number of times. If you go to that link, you will see a button to click on that says open for comment. You can put your comments right in there, or you can submit your comments in writing via mail to Mosquito Suppression Project, Superintendent Natalie Gates, Haleakala National Park, P.O. Box 369, Makawao, Hawaii 96768. And again, we'll repeat that mailing address later. Next slide, please. So what are the laws that guide the way we do environmental assessments? The first one is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which requires federal agencies such as the National Park Service to analyze the environmental impacts of federal actions and to engage the public, that's you, in the decision-making process. Because we are doing a joint environmental assessment with the state of Hawaii, we are also guided by the Hawaii Environmental Policy Act, or HEPA, which is similar to NEPA and requires state agencies to analyze the environmental and cultural impacts of their actions and to engage the public in the decision-making process. Next slide. So why are we doing this project? We are doing it because immediate action needs to be taken to prevent extinction of native forest birds on East Maui. Mosquitoes and the avian malaria that they carry are moving into higher elevation habitats and killing native forest birds. Next slide. What is the purpose of the project? The purpose is to substantially suppress or eliminate non-native mosquitoes and thus avian malaria in threatened and endangered forest bird populations on East Maui, thereby reducing extinction risks and contributing to the recovery of these species. Next slide. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Lainey Berry from the Department of Land and Natural Resources. Lainey?
Thank you, Natalie. Aloha, my name is Lainey Berry. I'm the Forest Bird Recovery Coordinator at the Hawaii Department of Lands and Natural Resources. I'll be introducing the Hawaiian forest birds and their threats. Hawaii's isolation has led to the evolution of a unique group of bird species. The Hawaiian honeycreepers are found nowhere else in the world. There were once more than 50 species of Hawaiian honeycreepers, but sadly, because of the impacts of human activities, many of these have gone extinct. The birds shown here in grey have all gone extinct in recent times. Today, only 17 honeycreeper species remain, some of them with fewer than 500 individuals left. If we don't act fast, many of these remaining species could become extinct in the next 10 years. Of the remaining 17 Hawaiian honeycreepers, only 2 are relatively stable in their populations. The remaining 15, shown in red, are endangered, threatened, or declining. Forest birds hold significance within Hawaiian culture and traditions. Feathered cloaks, helmets, and standards were created for ali'i, using feathers from birds. Birds are also seen as manifestations of the gods and play roles in creation stories and oral traditions. Beyond their significance to Hawaiian culture, birds are an integral part of the Hawaiian forest as they pollinate and disperse seeds of native plants. Maui has several forest bird species that are unique to Maui, and then several other species that are more widespread in the Hawaiian Islands. Sadly, like the rest of Hawaii, Maui has suffered from many native forest bird extinctions. There were once over 20 forest bird species known to have existed in Maui Nui before human arrival, but today only 6 remain. Of these 6, 3 are only found on Maui, the kiwikiu, akohekohe, and aloahio. 3 are threatened or endangered, the kiwikiu, akohekohe, and iiwi, and 2 are risk of extinction within the next 10 years, the kiwikiu and akohe-kohe. I'll now introduce you to the 3 threatened and endangered honey creepers of Maui Nui. The first one is the kiwikiu. It is one of 3 species that is unique to Maui Nui. It has a large parrot-like bill that's used to split branches, bark, and fruit to extract insect larvae. Its pre-human range was nearly island-wide on both Maui and Molokai, and it included lowland dry forest. However, the current range is very limited. It is restricted to a very narrow band of wet forest above 5,000 feet in elevation on the windward side of Maui, shown here in yellow. The current population size is incredibly small at only around 150 individuals. This is among the lowest of any native Hawaiian forest bird. And given current population trends, kiwikiu are predicted to go extinct within the next 10 years. The akohe-kohe is also found only in Maui Nui. It forages on nectar from ohia blossoms and small insects. It's one of the largest honey creepers, and it has a distinct punk-style haircut seen in the picture here. Similar to kiwikiu, the akohe-kohe was also once found all over Maui and Molokai, but today its range is even more restricted than the kiwikiu, shown here in purple. This may indicate that the akohe-kohe has even less disease tolerance than other honey creepers. The population size of the akohe-kohe is around 1,700 individuals, which is incredibly small, and is also predicted to go extinct within the next decade or 2. The iiwi is probably the most well-known Hawaiian honey creeper. It was among the most abundant birds before the arrival of Europeans. In the 1890s, it was reported as abundant on even Lanai, but by 1975, it was already extinct on that island. The iiwi was once found on all the main Hawaiian islands, but is now gone from Lanai, Molokai, and Oahu, is declining severely on Kauai, but has relatively high numbers in East Maui and on Big Island. It was listed as a threatened species in 2017 due primarily to the threat of avian malaria. Hawaiian forest birds have many threats causing their decline. Habitat loss, non-native predators, primarily cats, rats, and mongooses, feral ungulates that damage native habitat, non-native birds that can be competitors for food, predators, and vectors of disease. But the main threat facing native forest birds today is disease, and the most harmful disease present here is currently avian malaria, which is what we're focusing on today. Mosquitoes are not native to Hawaii. The southern house mosquito was introduced by a whaling vessel in Lahaina in 1826. Avian malaria, just like human malaria, is a disease caused by a parasite that is spread by mosquitoes. This disease was introduced to Hawaii in the early 20th century, likely contained in the blood of introduced birds. Because Hawaiian forest birds evolved in the absence of malaria and the mosquitoes that carry it, native Hawaiian birds, particularly the honey creepers, lost the natural immunities that their mainland ancestors may have had. And as a result, many Hawaiian honey creepers are highly susceptible to avian malaria, and a single bite can be enough to kill a honey creeper. The mosquitoes and the avian malaria parasite are restricted to lower elevations of Hawaii because they can only reproduce where temperatures are warm enough. This means the native forest birds have been wiped out from the lower elevations where mosquitoes are found, but they have been able to persist at higher elevations that are too cold for mosquitoes and avian malaria to survive. However, climate change is increasing temperatures at these higher elevations, and it is also changing the rainfall patterns in Hawaii and allowing mosquitoes and avian malaria to persist at higher elevations. These areas that were formerly mosquito-free and safe for forest birds are being invaded, and it's threatening to wipe out the remaining honey creepers in their last remaining safe habitat. And now I'm going to turn this over to Cynthia King to present the next section.
Thank you so much, Lainey. Hi, I'm Cynthia King, entomologist for the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, Division of Forestry and Wildlife. and I'm going to talk today about incompatible insect technique. So what is incompatible insect technique? Well, in short, it's the most promising tool we have to stop the extinctions of our native forest birds. And how does it work? Well, like most organisms, insects actually carry different bacteria inside of them that can influence their biology. In humans, bacteria are essential for how we survive, and they influence everything from how we fight infection to what allergies we have and how we digest our food. And just like someone might eat Activia yogurt to get helpful bacteria to aid in digesting our food, we can use bacteria as a way to reduce mosquito populations. And that's because in insects, including in mosquitoes, there are bacteria that actually affect their reproduction. So we can give a mosquito a certain kind of bacteria that makes reproduction with other mosquitoes impossible. And the approach is often referred to as birth control because the mosquitoes still mate and lay eggs, but those eggs won't hatch, which is what you see illustrated on the lower half of the screen. Next slide, please. So the bacteria that makes incompatible insect technique work is called Wolbachia. And Wolbachia is an endosymbiotic bacteria, which is just a fancy way of saying that it lives inside the body or cells of another organism. In this case, it lives inside the cells of insects. And to be clear, it cannot live within human cells. Wolbachia was originally identified from mosquitoes, but it's since been found in approximately 60% of insects worldwide. Wolbachia is actually already naturally present in fruit flies in your kitchen and the aphids and honeybees in your garden. And the bacteria's role in insect reproduction is likely one of the reasons that we have so many unique native insect species here in Hawaii as well. This picture shows an image of an insect cell, and those large circles inside of it are Wolbachia. The biology behind the reproductive incompatibility that Wolbachia causes is complicated, but the outcome is really simple. When boy mosquito meets girl mosquito, they can't make baby mosquitoes. Next slide, please. So how does incompatible insect technique work in practice? Well, in the wild, you have female mosquitoes, which in order to reproduce have to find male mosquitoes and mate and then lay eggs. So if you flood a system with males that are incompatible because they've been given Wolbachia, the likelihood is that only a small portion of those females will be able to successfully find and reproduce with wild males. Most of the females are going to encounter and mate with an incompatible male. And if you flood a system over multiple generations, you're going to see a significant crash in the mosquito populations. For this project, we are proposing to release incompatible male mosquitoes on East Maui. And in this area, we estimate that incompatible males would need to be released at a ratio of approximately 20:1 to achieve effective control. But what's really notable about this is you are only releasing male mosquitoes, and male mosquitoes don't bite people or animals because they only feed on nectar. It's also notable that this method requires continual applications of males with incompatible Wolbachia to achieve successful population suppression. If releases stop, the system actually returns to normal and the mosquito populations will rebound. Next slide, please. Mosquito incompatible insect technique using Wolbachia was actually developed for public health originally to control mosquitoes that cause human diseases. So here's a map of all the locations around the US and around the world where field trials or releases have already been conducted using Wolbachia IIT, incompatible insect technique. So if this project were to move forward, though, to control southern house mosquitoes on East Maui, it would be the first project to use incompatible insect technique for conservation, meaning saving our endangered native forest birds by controlling the invasive mosquitoes that infect them with malaria. I'll pass the presentation along to Chris Warren now to talk about the proposed project area. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Hi, my name is Chris Warren. I'm the Forest Bird Program Coordinator at Haleakala National Park. And as Cynthia said, this project would entail releasing incompatible male mosquitoes on the landscape to save these threatened birds. And for the environmental assessment, we needed to define a project area or where we are proposing to release these mosquitoes, which is shown here in red. So to orient you a little bit on this map, this is a map of East Maui. There's Hana on the right, Kahului in the upper left, Makawao Pukalani kind of in the middle there. And we want to have the effect of the reduced mosquito densities most at the higher elevations of this project area where we find the endangered birds. However, in order to do this, we may need to release incompatible male mosquitoes at lower elevations than where many of these birds are currently found, potentially in areas where mosquitoes are breeding at greater numbers and then dispersing uphill. We also don't know the hotspots for mosquito breeding, and as such, we've defined a fairly expansive project area of 262 square kilometers, or roughly 100 square miles, of mostly windward East Maui. And most of the area, as you can see, is well away from human activity and fairly remote. Now, we may not be able to nor need to release these male mosquitoes across this entire area, certainly not in the first few years as we're building capacity for this tool. And we expect to further refine the release techniques and release sites over time. Next slide, please. So here's the project area again, this time shown in red outline, and this indicates the land managers. And as you can see, most of this is owned and managed by the National Park Service, the State of Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, and the Nature Conservancy. Some additional private conservation lands owned and managed by Haleakala Ranch, East Maui Irrigation, and Mahi Pono. Next slide, please. Now, most of the area, the project area is super remote and difficult to access and work in. The majority is high elevation native forest that includes many areas of steep terrain and dense vegetation. And this fact dictates how we can go about applying this tool on the landscape. We don't yet know the optimal frequency of the releases for the incompatible male mosquitoes. However, initial releases may be as often as once per week at a specific release site, and perhaps once per month at that site. We also identified the period of May to October as a particularly optimal time for these releases. Previous studies on Maui and other islands indicate that October and November is often a peak month for mosquito numbers. So if we target the time period just before that peak, we can hopefully knock down the mosquito population before it has a chance to build up in the fall. Also, this time period helps avoid some impacts and disturbance during the releases, during the breeding season of many sensitive bird species. And finally, monitoring is a crucial part of this process. And this will mainly entail trapping for mosquitoes using established methods. This will allow us to fine-tune our releases in terms of timing, spacing, frequency. And we aim to make this as efficient as possible as we learn how the mosquito populations are responding to those initial releases. Next slide, please. We have identified 3 methods to release the male mosquitoes. These methods can be used in sequence or in concert with one another. One important note is that helicopters will likely play a role in all 3 methods. The flights will be integrated with ongoing management flights, and when helicopters can be avoided, we'll make all efforts to do so. The first method, or the pedestrian method, would include ground crews likely transported by a helicopter to remote field sites. Crew would then spread out from there along established management trails and fence lines and release mosquitoes by hand at the predetermined locations. The second method would use the helicopters themselves to disperse the mosquitoes. This is similar to a commonly used technique to control invasive species in very remote areas, such as pine trees and the crater. For this method, you'd have a release mechanism attached to a long line suspended below the helicopter. And this mechanism would then release the male mosquitoes near the canopy. And the actual mechanism that would release the mosquitoes and the pattern of deployment are still in development for this tool. The third method would utilize drones to release incompatible mosquitoes. And now this has been done for this application elsewhere in the world, and we're hoping to adapt their methods to this species of mosquito and to our needs here in Hawaii. In the previously used setup, you can see there in the picture on the right. An important detail for this method is that the Federal Aviation Administration requires that operators maintain line of sight to the drone at all times. So that, combined with battery life limitations, may mean that the operators have to fly the drones from remote backcountry sites. And depending on the location, extra staff may need to be transported to overlook points to maintain that line of sight. And one of the main purposes for this environmental assessment is to predict potential effects or impacts that the tool may have on resources. So far, we've identified 6 categories of effects, and we're looking for public comments from people such as yourselves to identify others. These are further defined in the newsletter that has been released and other environmental assessment documents that will be released in the future. But briefly, as far as potential effects on federally listed and species of concern, we expect that this tool will have either a negligible or beneficial effect. All native Hawaiian birds are impacted by avian malaria, whether or not they die from the disease. So reduction in mosquitoes is likely to only be to their benefit. However, there may be some temporary disturbance during the incompatible male mosquito releases. As for ethnographic resources, the National Park Service and State of Hawaii are consulting with members of the Hawaiian community on how we can identify cultural impacts and ways to reduce or eliminate those impacts. The cultural impact assessment is also being prepared and required under the HEPA side of this process. And for more details, we can cover it in questions or through the newsletter. Now, finally, for my section, this is the project schedule. So here we are in December and January. We'll have this is what's called the public scoping period. So this is an opportunity for you as members of the public to be involved in the process. Then in February and May, we'll prepare the environmental assessment, which will then be released for public review in June and July. And following that, we will review the public comments on the environmental assessment. And then around September, October 2022, we expect that the National Park Service and Department of Land and Natural Resources will be able to come to their decision on this. So thanks so much, and I will pass the presentation off to Jen for the question period.
Aloha. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to our presentations today. We are now going to begin the question and answers portion of our presentation today. So if you go to your webinar control panel, down at the bottom, you can click either questions or chat and write your questions in. For those questions, feel free to put them in there. Just a reminder on those questions for anybody who asks them, we'll try to get to them as we go to, and if not, you can always submit comments after the fact on our NPS planning website. So any questions from our audience? Well, it looks like we received a question. One of the questions we asked is, do you have a risk analysis that you can share with us? Perhaps Cynthia or Chris may be able to answer this question.
I don't think that I don't know if we have a specific risk analysis, but I would say that the greatest risk is that this doesn't work and we can't save these birds. And this is, I just want to repeat that this isn't an experimental technique. This has been conducted successfully many places in the world. The challenge for us will be adapting it to work here in Hawaii. You have anything to add, Cynthia?
I guess I would just add that the environmental assessment itself is meant to be a risk assessment, and that is something that we will, we are following all of the steps that we need to, and we'll make all of the assessments and judgments, public in that document.
Great. The next question that we have is, Culex occurs on all islands. What is happening, for instance, on the Big Island?
I guess I will say that there is a larger statewide group called Birds Not Mosquitoes that is organizing and talking with multiple organizations and agencies on hopefully being able to utilize this technique in many areas of Hawaii. Maybe somebody, Lainey, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have a concurrent environmental assessment process for Kauai, which we'll be beginning very shortly. And we also have a statewide environmental assessment planned for the remaining islands, including Big Island. So we are addressing the issue in Kauai and East Maui because that's where the forest birds are most critically endangered. So we wanted to address those areas first, but we do plan to widen the use of the tool to other areas, including endangered forest bird habitat on Big Island as well.
Thank you. Another question that we have is there funding for this project already allocated? Natalie?
I would answer that by saying partially. We are under a time crunch, and so we are actually doing a number of things at the same time. And the time crunch is the result of the highly endangered status of these birds. We do not have time to wait on this, so we are conducting the environmental compliance process, which is the process that we're involved in right now, at the same time that we are seeking funding. There are a number of avenues for that funding. We have a number of different agencies involved in this, not just the state of Hawaii and the National Park Service, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as USGS, and a number of nonprofits as well. So there is a large push for funding for this.
Thank you, Natalie. The next question we have is, what limitations are there on how many mosquitoes can be released? Wouldn't releasing as many males as possible be the best way to drop their numbers?
So I'm happy to answer this, but I see Josh Fisher has turned on his camera. So would you like to take that question, Josh?
Yeah, so the amount of mosquitoes that you would want to release, it's kind of specified on a specific ratio to be most effective. And you wouldn't want to just release as many mosquitoes as possible because it costs money to produce those mosquitoes, and you want to be efficient with your resources and use just what you need to make the tool effective.
Thank you. Another question, this one maybe for Cynthia or Chris. How soon after implementation may results be seen?
Given that this is the first time that this approach will be used in a natural area, it's not entirely clear, but I think we are hopeful that we would see high levels of suppression within a 6-month period. Suppression will immediately result at a smaller scale, and then it's iterative as you repeat the releases, and the mosquito populations get proportionally lower on the landscape.
And on the bird side, we know that some of these birds can die as soon as 9 days after being bit by an infected mosquito. So every one that is off the landscape is potentially a bird saved. And fortunately, even though mosquitoes are reaching higher and higher elevations, they are at their lowest densities at the higher elevations. And so if we are successful in targeting that area that's sourcing those mosquitoes that are getting up there, we should be able to protect the most endangered birds, at least in a number of locations, priority locations. We could do that very quickly.
Thank you. And while we're on this topic, another follow-up question to that is, are you using a particular strain of Wolbachia? Is it present here on Maui, or will it be new to the island?
So that's an excellent question. There are a few different tools that might be available to us, and they might contain, and those tools contain different strains of Wolbachia from one another. The first tool is a Culex mosquito that contains Wolbachia that actually came from a different Aedes mosquito. And those indeed are present all over Hawaii already, the Aedes species and the bacteria that is inside of them. But certainly you can use this approach and use different strains of Wolbachia that are from other populations or other places. The technique is the same, but the bacteria strain can be different.
Thank you. And then Chris, question for you. Are there any impacts to bats that eat mosquitoes?
So one of the sort of interesting thing when we talk about mosquito control is not a lot of organisms just around the world depend on them as a major source of food. And definitely that is true for our native bats here. As we mentioned, mosquitoes were introduced fairly recently. And so as far as I know, and maybe Lainey or Cynthia can correct me, but they don't typically feed on mosquitoes at all in any life stage. And if you think about it, there's not much to them. You know, bats would much prefer to get a much larger meal, like from a beetle or a moth, that contains a lot more calories. There's very few bats, even on the mainland U.S., that eat mosquitoes, let alone depend on them.
Another question that was asked is, how are you including the Hawaiian community? I'll just start with that one. Chris had mentioned earlier that there's a larger group working together from multiple agencies and non-governmental organizations called Birds Not Mosquitoes. Already, we've had several conversations with members of the Hawaiian community about this proposed project and their input, their knowledge that they can share, and their thoughts and comments. Does anybody else want to add to that on how we are including the Hawaiian community?
I would just follow up by saying, as Natalie mentioned earlier as well, that for the HEPA process, a cultural impact assessment is required, and it pairs with the environmental assessment. So their National Park Service is also conducting, or has contracted a consulting firm to conduct a cultural impact assessment that will take into account additional voices of Hawaiian practitioners and community members. And that same process will be followed when we conduct the environmental compliance for Kauai or for statewide, any statewide EA that's conducted.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia and Jen. And I would just add that the park is going through its federal Section 106 process as well. So consulting with the Hawaiian community on the area of potential effect and historic properties that might be impacted by the project. So we do have consultation letters going out, and we'll be doing that throughout this EA process.
Thank you. Another question that we have, Lainey, perhaps you can answer this one. Which birds will possibly go extinct while you wait for final approval? how will you monitor success?
So we hope none. That's our goal. On Maui, the bird that is most at risk of extinction is the kiwikiu, followed by the akohekohe. We will monitor the success. We'll be continuing to monitor closely the forest bird populations, during the entirety of this project. We do forest bird surveys every 5 years, and we also conduct intense monitoring on the ground. So we will continue that throughout the project to monitor the numbers of the particularly these two species.
And the next question we have is, do you have a plan B?
Do you want me to take this one?
Sure.
We don't have a plan B currently. We're in intense discussions about options, but we don't have one currently.
Next question. Perhaps Chris can answer this one. How long will Wolbachia releases have to occur to manage mosquito population levels?
So one of the challenges, but also strengths of this system is that, or this tool, is that it's self-limiting. And so, as Cynthia mentioned, as soon as you stop releasing the incompatible male mosquitoes, we expect that the mosquito population will rebound, and then the problem represents itself. And so this will be a continual process, and we expect and hope that we just become more and more efficient at it and more targeted with the tool over time. That project area is really big, but I think we're going to learn more and more, as we have, about the mosquito population just in the past few years, and as I said, get better at it over time. But yeah, for this to work, it has to happen in perpetuity until another tool comes along.
Thank you, Chris. Another question, almost in that same vein, was another question we came in was, has there been talks or about collaboration about releasing male mosquitoes in other conservation areas around the island?
For right now, this environmental assessment is just for the project area that I presented on Windward East Maui. But as Lainey and Cynthia mentioned, there are additional processes that we're hoping coming down the pike for other areas throughout the state in the future.
Thank you. Cynthia, in your section of the presentation, you showed a map. We have a question. Has this been conducted in a highly isolated ecosystem like Maui? Most of the places on the map are not isolated.
Yeah, that's a good observation. There were a lot of stars on that map, and so it might have been hard to notice that there were stars on places like Singapore and Fiji and Vanuatu, and I think even Sri Lanka, where either small-scale trials or limited releases have been conducted already. And we should clarify, though, that the likelihood is that we would not be achieving eradication of the mosquitoes even from within this project area. What we're looking is for really high levels of population suppression, but because we are targeting a portion of the island, we recognize that there will be continual migration from other areas of the southern house mosquito into the forest bird habitat. And our goal is really to control it within those refuges, within the refugia, and where the birds remain. So in case there was any confusion about that, we were trying to eradicate island-wide. I just wanted to make that distinction.
And I would just add that I think what is unique, I mean, this is the first conservation application of this tool. The other ones have been used in actually populated areas, urban centers where mosquitoes have been of public health concern. So what is unique about this, it is more remote, so the access to which, to get to these project areas is more challenging than where those other applications have been.
Thank you, Cynthia and Josh. The next question that we have is, what can the average person do to help move this process forward as efficiently and as quickly as possible, aside from commenting? Natalie?
I would say that the most important thing is to communicate with your friends and neighbors and family accurate information about this project. It can be viewed as a complicated scientific project, but in essence, it is not. And the risks to humans and to other species are quite low. The upside could be amazing, but we are dealing with such a critical problem that it is really important for the public to truly understand what we're doing and to support us. So I would say community support and accurate flow of information is what people can really do.
Thank you. And a follow-up to that question is, can we be directed to anything specific, suggested wording for public comment that will do the most good for moving this forward?
I would say as many public comments as that we could receive that demonstrate widespread support for these projects on East Maui, and later on Kauai, and later on statewide, if that is what is being pursued, that will only help.
The next question we have is, if not enough mosquitoes are released to suppress populations, is there a risk that mosquitoes will evolve resistance to this technique?
We are not concerned about that. In short, if our calculations were incorrect and not enough incompatible males were released, all that would happen is that wild females and wild males would continue to find themselves together on the landscape and continue to reproduce in the way that they always have. This is a species that is present across the Hawaiian Islands, as up into the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, on every island we have from sea level to the mountains. And so it's already incredibly widespread, and us not releasing enough incompatible males will simply allow them to continue at their current population rate.
Thank you, Cynthia. The next question we have is, are the mosquitoes moving to higher elevations connected to the water being taken from the streams, leaving more standing water? Can returning more healthy stream flows in East Maui benefit native forest birds by removing or reducing mosquito breeding grounds?
That is a fascinating question. I think that restoring healthy water systems and watersheds in Hawaii has enormous benefits for many, many things. I don't think that that's the case here. I think that changing climate is altering rainfall patterns to their benefit. So we might have what's predicted are more intense storms at different times of the year, and then more and longer drying periods, which allows for more small pools and things. Where these mosquitoes are actually breeding, as in laying their eggs and the larvae being produced, varies in different habitats. And it's really difficult to find all the areas that they breed in, but we know that they can breed in just a tiny little puddle. So I think that, you know, removing the water for agriculture or for whatever reasons, it's not necessarily drawing the water down from the upper elevation areas.
Although if I could just follow up, I will say that healthy Hawaiian streams are flashy. Water moves through them and doesn't stagnate for very long, typically. And when we do have areas where man-made structures, for example, or remnants of man-made structures that haven't been removed entirely, create pockets where that flashiness cannot, where the water is not flushed regularly in the way it normally would be. Those pockets can produce mosquitoes, and I believe, you know, there's some good data from USGS folks on the Big Island that do show that small amounts of standing water can sort of produce really significant numbers of mosquitoes. So depending on the areas that we're talking about, and the fact that Chris has mentioned that, you know, given how good they are at transmitting avian malaria, it is possible that some pockets, if poorly located, could be big sources depending on how high up they are. So I don't think that has been studied though, but it's something that we've observed.
And I would just add, I think that's one of the values of this insect incompatibility technique tool. While it's been troubling to find a lot of the breeding sites in the forest, or to find all of them, the mosquitoes will find that. They will find it, and thus making the tool more effective.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, in the future, is it possible this method may remove mosquitoes from the environment entirely?
I can jump in. It's given the size of our island, of Maui, for example, and our other main Hawaiian islands, it seems like it would be a really difficult approach to achieve eradication. We would be really pleasantly surprised to find out that that we will have greater success and that we could be able to release over a much larger area and achieve that suppression. And I think as this project or other projects, if they are able to move forward, we'll get a much better sense of how that could work in the future. But again, right now, because most of the data and most of the examples have come from more urban areas, as Josh Fisher mentioned, it's hard for us to know yet how it will play out over our, you know, really diverse and yeah, really diverse natural landscapes here.
Thank you. Another question we have is, are the larger forest birds such as Io or alala more resistant to mosquitoes?
They are more resistant to avian malaria. They still suffer from other mosquito-borne diseases. This is probably not to do with their size. It's probably due to how, you know, what their evolutionary history in Hawaii. The more recently they've arrived, or the more recently their ancestor arrived, the more immunity they probably have. But they are still, that, you know, obviously the you know, the Io is still state listed as an endangered species. The alalar is, a critically endangered species, and there's currently no wild population. They suffer. There's many different threats that they are suffering from, including mosquito-borne diseases. But they don't seem to be as susceptible to avian malaria as the honey creepers, because, and we see that in their distribution. They're not restricted to, at least the EO is not restricted to the lower elevations like the honey creepers are. There is some variability in resistance even within honey creepers. So the Hawaii amakihi can survive at relatively lower elevations. The apapane seems to have a little more resistance. So even within honey creepers, we can see maybe some development of some resistance in some areas, which is good news.
Thank you, Lainey. The next question that we have is, feral pigs increase mosquito habitat. Should we ramp up feral pig control?
I guess I will say there is a lot of ongoing ungulate control in many areas, particularly within the endangered bird ranges, and that will be ongoing as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in on that one and echo what Chris said. The upper elevations of this project area are fenced, and ungulate control is ongoing. So numbers of pigs are very low in the upper elevations where this project is planned. And then below those fences, this project area does extend down into lower areas, and we continue to look at and scope the potential for expanding those fenced units and ungulate control down into those areas.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Chris. The next question that we have is, why wouldn't you pursue a tool that targets eradication versus suppression? Genetic techniques?
Yeah, I guess I can comment on that. So there are a range of tools that are being developed, I guess, within that realm. But as far as one that could achieve eradication, there isn't one that is available or even has a consistent regulatory path to pursue at this point. And so there are a lot more ethical questions and discussions associated with those tools, because they are a lot more powerful. And so, we're focused on one that is localized and doesn't persist in the environment. But certainly those tools, as they become options in the future, that could be more efficient, more effective, would be worth considering, because like this current technique, hopefully, it achieves the results that we would want, but it is a stopgap measure to deal with the urgency that we have.
Thank you. The next question that we have is it possible for immunity to evolve in the birds?
Yes, it is possible. However, it takes a really long time, and these birds do not have that time. These particular species will become extinct. They've not shown any resistance. They can only survive currently where mosquitoes are absent. Anywhere where there's mosquitoes, they've been wiped out. Like I mentioned before, there are some honey creepers that appear to have, lower elevation populations that do appear to show increased levels of immunity. There's research going on at USGS right now looking at levels of immunity. So this is an ongoing study, but for these endangered species, there's no time.
And I would just add, it's been like a little about 200 years, and maybe only one species, the amakihi, is showing some signs of that, but these other species that we're talking about, they're in such small numbers. There isn't enough numbers for them to kind of evolve and develop that immunity.
And in addition to that, a lot of these that have such low numbers also have low genetic diversity, which is a mechanism oftentimes that evolution works on. And also, many of these species breed very slowly. They just don't produce that many offspring within their lifetimes. And so the evolutionary speed is lower.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, will any of those Wolbachia strains be engineered? Cynthia, perhaps you can answer this question.
No. So the Wolbachia strains are already naturally occurring in the environment, and they are not being further genetically manipulated in any way before the mosquitoes are getting that bacteria, that different bacteria. And again, just likening it to the example of Activia yogurt, not to belabor that, but it's a bacteria that's already present in the environment in some form, and we put it in a form that it makes it such that we can put it into our body safely and digest it and have that bacteria be helpful to us. So it's similar in that sense. It is something that it's a strain that doesn't necessarily occur in that species, but not because it can't occur in that species and not because it has any other adverse effects.
Thanks for clarifying, Cynthia. The next question we have is there any information on a long-term plan? Are there yearly releases for maintaining low numbers?
Josh already kind of spoke to this, like that this is sort of first generation in terms of attacking the mosquito densities and the diseases that they carry. We do hope, as I said, to become more efficient with it, and it might also be that we can do releases of perhaps larger numbers and then release fewer mosquitoes or less often over time. I mean, if it works on the ratio, as we mentioned, 20-to-1, as the population density goes down, you would, in theory, be able to tailor your release numbers to the appropriate number. And I expect we'll just get better and better at finding out where the best places to release them and how often, and then change that over time. We don't know if it's going to be yearly at some point, or if it will always need to be monthly, or at certain times of the year be monthly and other times of the year be bi-monthly and things like that. So that will come from our monitoring from these initial releases and trials before.
Thank you, Chris. The last question that we have is, not that we could catch every wild bird, but is there a vaccine for avian malaria?
There is an experimental vaccine in development. I believe it's been used on penguins. It would be a long way off, and we would need to show that it worked on honey creepers. And yeah, like the audience member pointed out, it would require us catching the birds to give them the vaccine, and it wouldn't be passed on to their offspring. There is a treatment for malaria, but that again, you know, that requires that really the birds have to be in captivity because it requires regular treatments over time. So yeah, both of these options are not really practical for wild birds.
I would just add that that vaccine, if it were to be developed, could potentially save that individual bird that is treated, but not necessarily passed on to their offspring. So that would be another temporary measure. And I don't want to take that out of our toolbox if that comes along. But yeah, as has been said, catching all those birds and putting them through that would be certainly an extreme measure, difficult. But I'll do it if I have to.
Yeah, we'll certainly keep an eye on that as an option if it becomes available.
Great, thank you. Those are the last of the questions. I think many of the other questions were answered by other answers and responses. If anybody in the attendees list, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat or the questions box now so we can get those questions answered for you. We'll just give everybody a minute or so. There was one question that we didn't get to yet. It was, how many field staff is anticipated or needed for this type of project?
I guess I would answer with TBD, right? To be determined. I think I expect it will scale up over time, and it will depend on what method of release is being used, when and where. Certainly that pedestrian method, as I mentioned, would probably entail a lot of hours on the ground with people, and probably would be the maximum number of people that we can get. And then it will also depend on the frequency of releases that are required. You know, many of us love to be in the backcountry, but we can't be there permanently. So that would also impact the number of people.
And we'll also need, there's other aspects of this. There would be monitoring of the mosquito numbers, monitoring of the birds. These are all that monitoring we are already conducting. We would probably, you know, we're monitoring mosquito numbers in these areas, and we're monitoring the forest birds. We would probably need to ramp that up, but it is already occurring in these particular areas.
I think I would also just add, in addition to field staff, and I know that's where the question was, there's also the capacity to, you know, to rear these mosquitoes. And while that capacity is not here in Hawaii, that would be an aim down the road if this seems to be a viable tool, a tool that is successful.
Thank you. The next question we have is, which other techniques in NEPA were discarded to select this? Natalie?
So let me just be clear. We have not selected this alternative. We are at the beginning of the environmental assessment process. And though we've talked a lot about this alternative, it is a proposed alternative. And from here on, so we're looking for other alternatives from the public. If there are other alternatives out there, we're looking for information, we're looking for suggestions, and then all of that information along with the actual analysis of any impacts of these actions would go into the final decision. So no decision has been made to date. In terms of what alternatives have been rejected, none have been rejected to date. Again, we are at the beginning of the process.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay, our next question. Thank you all for your time. Can each speaker share a little bit about what drew them to conservation field, or specifically the conservation of Hawaiian forest birds?
Are we going to go down the line?
Maybe for the sake of time, we'll have Chris and then maybe someone from the state that would like to just share briefly, because we do have
Sure.
other questions that are coming in.
Yes, and thank you for those. I have worked with birds and endangered birds for my whole career. And I'm not entirely sure what drew me to them initially, but they sure are cool. And they get me out in really, really interesting places. And not too long into it, that's where my passion lay, you know? So I can't envision doing something else. This is part of who I am.
Shall I go? I grew up in Australia. I was fortunate to grow up in an area that was surrounded by birds. I started bird watching when I was about 8 years old. I have since leaving Australia, I've worked across several different Pacific islands. I was drawn to Hawaii because of this exact reason. It is the extinction capital for birds of the world. It is a heartbreaking place to work, but is also incredibly inspiring. Working with these people, such a passionate group of people with a community that's so connected with the environment and these species. It's it really it's incredibly, even though it is tragic, but it's also very heartwarming to see how passionate the community is about their species, and how proud they are of the Hawaiian species. So I feel very fortunate to have ended up here.
Thank you, Chris and Lainey, for sharing your own personal stories and how you got involved with conservation. The next question that we have, and perhaps Rachel can answer this one. Can you provide an example of how cultural impacts will be monitored pre, during, and post implementation?
Hi there. Yeah, so I mean, we're still assessing cultural impacts. I think that, we're aware that these are very special areas and with cultural significance. So in looking at some of the impacts from the project, I think the newsletter goes into it a bit, but, we're going to be bringing personnel and helicopters and things into these areas. So I think we are looking for feedback on this, but trying to minimize any disturbances along the way, avoiding cultural sites, minimizing noise, and keeping operations to just what's kind of necessary to have the project be effective. So that's my answer now, but I think we're going to be, that's why we're doing this EA too, is to assess what the cultural impacts might be and how we can minimize them during the project.
Thank you, Rachel. Next question we have is, we've been talking about the threat of avian malaria in Hawaiian forest birds for decades. Do you think that you have adequate support and motivation at this point to get the control done within the next few years?
So I would say that we wouldn't be here if we didn't think that we could do it. We honestly, we have no choice. The alternative is extinction or trying to make this a successful project. And I think everybody working on this understands that there is a possibility that we will not be successful, but doing nothing is not an option. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, you find honey creepers in Volcanoes National Park, at less than 4,000 feet of elevation. Here on Maui, they only exist much higher. What is going on with that? Both islands have Culex mosquitoes.
I can take a stab at that. There is another complicating factor of habitat that influences the distribution of these birds. And then you also have different tolerances for each of the bird species to malaria. And so on each island, you oftentimes see the more resistant species can exist at lower and lower elevations, but then that's complicated with available habitat. And some species have a greater tolerance for non-native forest, for instance, than others. So things like Iiwi and Apapane seem to have a tolerance for certain non-native trees and can do just fine. And certainly Amakihi, they love to eat things like banana poka and stuff, and seem to be very adaptable in that respect. So we do have some species here on Maui that exist below 4,000 feet. There are even places on Hana Highway where you can see Amakihi, for instance, and places particularly on the west side that you can see both Apapane and Amakihi below 1,000 feet. But a lot of that is also driven by habitat and probably local adaptations to the habitat and disease.
Thank you, Chris. At this time, there's no more new questions that I can see. If anybody else has any other questions they would like answered today, please go ahead and type it into the questions chat. I'll give folks another minute or so if there's any other additional questions. Okay, looks like one of the last questions that we received is, where do I find the newsletter? So the newsletter is located on the website, https://parkplanning.nps.gov/HALE-mosquito. Once you get to that website, you can click on it and view newsletter from there. If you're unable to find it, just let us know and we're happy to send that to you as well. And without any other questions, I just have a couple closing remarks as we go forward. So I've shared that park website a couple times now, and if we could advance to the next slide, thank you. If you would like to submit formal comments, they can be received in 2 different ways: electronically at the website listed here on the page, and also in the chat we have shared that link as well. You can also submit it in writing with your comments written to Mosquito Suppression Project, Superintendent Natalie Gates, Haleakala National Park, P.O. Box 369, Makawao, Hawaii at 96768. Just as a reminder, any questions or comments shared during this webinar today, these are not considered formal comments. So please, if you would like your voices heard and your opinions and thoughts and knowledge that you have that you would like to share with us to be considered for this project, please go ahead and do so by January 20th. Those comments, the comment period is open now, and you could submit all the way up until January 20th in 2022. Next slide. A couple tips for submitting public comments. Please make sure that your comments are relevant to the issues and proposed action that we talked about today. That's also displayed on our park website and in the newsletter. Comments that contribute to project alternatives are helpful. So if you have other ideas of things that should be considered or need to be considered for this project, please go ahead and make sure to include those as well. Comments that note other potential impacts are also really helpful. So things that maybe were not discussed or maybe not present here, but you have knowledge of and you'd like to share with us, make sure to include those in your comments. And the website is available for instructions, and I gave out the address for those public comments as well. All right. Thank you everybody for attending our meeting tonight. This meeting will be recorded and posted on our website for future viewing. That's at parkplanning.mps.gov/Hale-mosquito. So you can go back and view this presentation again or review anything that was made here or comments that were made here today. If you want to make a formal comment, just visit the website or send that in by mail. And this concludes today's presentation. Before I conclude today's presentation, we will have another presentation on January 6th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. That meeting will be identical to the presentation that you see today. So if you attended today, there's not a need unless you'd like to attend the other one on January 6th. It's also a great opportunity for you to share and invite others to come to this meeting to learn more about this project. Thank you everybody for attending tonight. Mahalo.